There was a house at the edge of Willow Lane, its stones weathered, its windows clouded with age, and its garden wild as a secret. To most people in town, the house was simply part of the landscape, something you passed on your way to somewhere else. But those who looked closer noticed the light in the uppermost window, a soft golden glow that flickered even on stormy nights. Inside, Margaret lived alone. She had arrived in the village some 40 years earlier, when her hair was only touched with gray and her step still light as a bird's. Now, her hair was white and her hands covered in delicate blue veins, but her mind remained sharp and her eyes sparkled with quiet curiosity. Margaret's days followed gentle routines. She woke before dawn, brewed strong tea in a cracked porcelain pot, and wandered her tangled garden, speaking softly to the roses, the foxgloves, and the ancient oak that stretched its branches over her back door. The villagers sometimes saw her there, stooped over a flower bed or standing perfectly still, eyes closed, as if listening for whispers hidden in the breeze. Children dared each other to run past her gate, but Margaret was always kind to those brave enough to greet her, offering homemade jam or a snip of fresh mint. The house itself was filled with memories. Each room held relics of another life, photographs in faded silver frames, neatly folded letters tied with blue ribbon, a silk scarf draped over the arm of an armchair. There were secrets in the dusty attic and mysteries in the cellar. Margaret sometimes said that the house remembered everything that had ever happened within its walls. On evenings, Margaret sat in her favorite chair with a book or a bit of knitting, her black cat, Amos, curled by her feet. The world outside the window would grow quiet, the garden bathed in moonlight, and she would let her thoughts drift back through time, back to days spent traveling the world, to friends long gone, and to one particular letter she kept locked in a small wooden box beneath her bed. No one in the village knew much about Margaret's past, but all agreed there was something gentle and mysterious about her. She seemed to carry stories within her, as if she was waiting for someone to ask the right question, to sit quietly and listen as she turned her memories into words. But this year, something felt different. The air was heavy with change, and a series of small, inexplicable events would soon unsettle the quiet rhythm of Margaret's days. The old house on Willow Lane was about to give up some of its secrets, and Margaret's story was only just beginning. The morning sun streamed through Margaret's kitchen window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. She sat at her small, round table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. Margaret's mind wandered to the letter kept safe in the wooden box beneath her bed, a letter she had not read in over a decade. Its presence had always comforted her, a silent companion through quiet nights and stormy afternoons. But lately, she found herself thinking about it more, as if the house itself was quietly urging her to remember. That morning, after tending to the garden, Margaret made a decision. She climbed the narrow staircase to her bedroom, the floorboards creaking under her weight. Her old cat, Amos, trailed behind, ever curious about Margaret's quiet rituals. Padding softly across the faded rug, she knelt beside her bed and reached for the box. It was small, carved from dark walnut, and locked with a delicate brass clasp. Margaret's fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside, the letter rested on top of a few small keepsakes, an ivory button, a pressed violet from a long-ago spring, and a tarnished silver locket. The envelope was yellow with age, the handwriting elegant and unmistakable. Sitting on the edge of her bed, Margaret carefully unfolded the letter. The words, though familiar, made her heart beat just a little faster. It was from Edward, her dearest friend and, once, her dearest love. They had met during the war, when life had been both uncertain and bursting with the possibility of new beginnings. The letter was filled with talk of hope, memories of shared laughter, and a promise that he would return, that they would build a life together. But Edward had never come back. She had received only one more letter after this, a hasty goodbye written in a shaky hand, and then the silence that followed had stretched on for years. Margaret had never talked about Edward to anyone in the village. Some stories were too delicate to share with those who hadn't lived them. As she sat there, lost in the ache of old memories, a sharp rapping at the front door startled her. Amos leapt from the bed and hissed softly, eyes wide. Margaret tucked the letter back into the box, shut the lid, and slipped it beneath the bed. When she opened the door, A boy from the village stood on her step, holding an envelope much fresher and brighter than the one Margaret had just handled. He handed it to her, shy and stammering, before he darted away. Closing the door, Margaret studied the new envelope. The handwriting was unfamiliar, yet her name was written carefully on the front, Margaret Wells. With a trembling hand, she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief, mysterious message. Some secrets refuse to remain buried. Meet me at the old railway bridge at sunset. Come alone. Margaret's heart pounded. Who could possibly know about the secret she kept? Glancing up, she saw the old house reflected in the glass of the front door, its secrets tightening around her like the shadows at dusk. For the first time in many years, the quiet of Willow Lane was broken by something new. Fear, curiosity, and just a little touch of hope. Margaret folded the note and pressed it to her heart. The past, it seemed, was not finished with her yet. Margaret spent the long afternoon caught in a whirlwind of thoughts she had not allowed herself in years. The mysterious note rested heavy in the pocket of her cardigan as she moved through her daily chores, yet every familiar action, watering the roses, feeding Amos, heating broth for supper, felt distant and unreal. As the sun dipped lower in the sky and the shadows grew long and blue across Willow Lane, Margaret's curiosity overcame her hesitation. She donned her favorite shawl, the one with embroidered forget-me-nots along its edge, and set out for the old railway bridge on the far side of the village. Her walk was slow but steady. The villagers she passed glanced up in surprise, unaccustomed to seeing Margaret out so late in the day. She offered a tight, distracted smile, her mind focused on the note's promise. The railway bridge was a relic from another time. Steel grated and rusted, its tracks unused for decades, it spanned a narrow stream at the edge of the woods. The last gold of the day shimmered on the water as she arrived, her steps muffled by the soft earth. Margaret saw no one at first, only the flutter of leaves and the call of a blackbird. She waited, suddenly unsure. Perhaps she had misunderstood the note, or perhaps she should have ignored it altogether. Then, from the shadow of the far embankment, a figure stepped forward. At first, she could see only outline, a slim, tall person in a dark coat, their hair glinting silver in the evening light. Margaret's heart hammered. She clutched her shawl tightly, standing her ground. The figure stopped a few feet away, hesitating, as if measuring Margaret's resolve. When finally they spoke, the voice was low and unfamiliar. "Are you Margaret Wells?" they asked. Margaret nodded. "I am. And you?" The person hesitated again, then reached into their coat and drew out something wrapped in a faded handkerchief. "I did not mean to frighten you. My name is Thomas. Here his words fumbled. I believe you knew my father, Edward Langley." The name struck Margaret like a cold wind. "Edward," she breathed. "Could it be?" Thomas continued, his eyes searching Margaret's face. "My father is gone now. He passed away last spring. Going through his things, I found letters. Letters he wrote to you, and letters you wrote to him. He never sent most of them to you. He kept your photograph in his desk all these years." Margaret's knees weakened, and she gripped the rail for steadying. "Why have you come to see me?" Thomas held out the handkerchief. Inside was a small, leather-bound diary. "He wanted me to find you after he was gone. There are things he wished you to know about the past and about a secret he carried all his life." Margaret accepted the diary, hands trembling, not from age this time, but from the flood of a life she had not dared revisit. For a long moment, the two stood surrounded by quiet and memory, the old bridge bearing silent witness. Thomas's expression was gentle, his presence respectful, a stranger, yet not a stranger. As dusk folded itself around them and the first stars appeared, Margaret realized that tonight was not the end of her story, but the beginning of something new. The secret she had carried was not hers alone. Now, it was time to confront what lay hidden in their intertwined pasts, and to discover what the truth would bring. Margaret turned the small, leather-bound diary over in her hands as she walked back to her home on Willow Lane. Thomas walked by her side in silence, knowing instinctively that conversation could wait. Both were deep in their own thoughts, Margaret's mind flickered back and forth between the present and long-forgotten memories of Edward, the laughter in their younger days, the pain in his last letter, and now, this unexpected link in the form of Edward's son. As they reached her gate, Margaret paused and looked up at Thomas. In the deepening dusk, her blue eyes were sharp and questioning. "Will you come in?" she asked. Her voice softer now, weighted with emotion. Thomas nodded, following the old woman into the comforting gloom of her parlor. Amos, the ever-watchful cat, regarded their guest warily from atop the sideboard. Margaret set a kettle on the stove and the two sat beside the window, its panes shimmering with dew. Thomas glanced around, taking in the books and trinkets, the faded photographs, and the lingering warmth that made the old house a place of refuge. They spoke little as Margaret poured the tea, both bracing themselves for whatever the diary might contain. With trembling hands, Margaret opened the first page. The familiar scroll of Edward's handwriting reached out to her from across the decades. The entries began shortly after their meeting during the war. Snatches of poetry, longing, frustration with the separation, and then, woven between lines of affection, the first mention of a secret. Thomas explained in hushed tones, "My father never told me everything, but after he died, I found a packet of letters and this diary locked away. I read only the first pages. I thought you should read the rest first." He hesitated, his uncertainty plain. He always spoke of someone he lost, a woman he cared for very deeply. I never understood the depth of that shadow in him until now. Margaret read for hours, the lamp flickering as night deepened. Edward's words told of love forbidden by circumstance, of a promise made and broken not by choice, but by fate's cruel hand. There were hints of a hidden affair and of a child, something Margaret had never known. The revelation spilled forth, mingling with her own fractured recollections and half-buried hopes. At last, Margaret closed the diary, holding it tightly to her chest. Tears shone in her eyes, not only for what she had lost, but for all she had never suspected. Thomas waited for her to speak, his own expression stricken with the uncertainty of what this history might mean for them both. Finally, Margaret drew a long breath. Her voice was steady, the years seeming to fall away for a moment. "Edward should have told me. I would have understood. It might have changed everything." In the stillness that followed, Margaret's house seemed to hold its breath with her. Thomas rose to go, pausing at the door. "There's more," he said quietly. "My father wrote that if I ever found you, I should tell you what happened at Talbot's Crossing." Margaret's hand tightened on the diary. The name rang out in her memory, a place she had not dared think of in decades. "I'll come tomorrow," Thomas said, "if you'd like." Margaret nodded, her heart raw but awake. The past, it seemed, was not through with her yet, and Talbot's Crossing held more answers than she had ever dared hope. As the door closed softly behind Thomas, Margaret allowed herself, for the first time in years, to imagine the healing power of truth and the possibility of new beginnings. After a mostly sleepless night, Margaret awoke with both dread and anticipation. The words Talbot's Crossing had consumed her thoughts, stirring hazy recollections and long-repressed fears. The crossing was not merely a place. It was a turning point in her youth, a site forever linked with choices she'd tried to forget. Thomas arrived early, his face solemn but hopeful. Margaret greeted him with a gentle nod and invited him in, offering tea though both of their hands seemed to tremble. Sitting across the table, Margaret finally broke the silence. "Talbot's Crossing was where I last saw Edward," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was just after the war. We planned to meet one Friday night to decide our future together." She traced trembling fingers along the diary's cracked spine. "But when I arrived, only his letter was waiting with a stranger. There was no explanation, just a plea for forgiveness and a promise to keep me safe from what I never understood." Thomas listened intently, eyes wide with recognition. "My father wrote in his diary about a threat. He hinted he was involved in something, a secret link to someone in the village, something dangerous." Margaret nodded, looking away. Those were troubled times. There were men in our town who did not want certain secrets revealed, especially during the chaos that followed the war. Edmund, I think he was afraid for me, maybe for himself too. Thomas reached across the table, placing a hand gently over Margaret's wrinkled fingers. His last entry mentioned a hidden letter. He said it would explain everything, and that it could only be found at Talbot's Crossing. Margaret's heart rose in her chest. The old railway bridge at Talbot's Crossing had seemed to fade from her life, but perhaps it was time to return, one final time. That evening, with Thomas's quiet encouragement, Margaret wrapped herself in her warmest shawl, tucked the diary into her bag, and together they set out. The world outside had softened into gold and blue, the air charged with the hush of old secrets. As they approached the crossing, Margaret's memory sharpened. She remembered the place Edward would sometimes hide notes for her, a loose stone at the base of a sycamore where the path bent beside the bridge. Kneeling carefully, Thomas pushed aside leaves and roots until his fingers found a gentle hollow. With Margaret watching, he drew out a tattered envelope, sealed tightly and yellowed with time. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, Edward's. Margaret took the letter, hands trembling. Together, beneath the fading sky, she opened it and began to read aloud. Edward's words spilled out, finally and at last, the story of a dangerous truth, a betrayal in the village, and his desperate act to keep Margaret out of harm's way. There were names, some she recognized, others whispered only in rumor, and the evidence Edmund had gathered, evidence that had cost him his future with her. As the last words faded, Margaret looked up at Thomas, tears streaming down her face. He left not because he stopped loving me, but because he wanted to save me. In that moment, the shadows of Talbot's Crossing seemed to lift, replaced by a gentle, long overdue light. For the first time in many years, Margaret felt free from the past bindings and hopeful for what might yet come. The following days passed quietly, yet with a subtle transformation in Margaret's world. The long-sealed secrets, the letters and diaries, and Thomas's gentle presence stirred something in her heart that had long been dormant. She spent her mornings reading through Edward's diary, revisiting old memories with clearer understanding and a softened sorrow. The truth, that Edward had never stopped loving her, and that everything had been done for her safety, brought an unexpected peace. Thomas became a regular visitor in Margaret's home, not just as a link to her lost love, but as a new and real friend. There were afternoons spent in warm conversation about Edward, the stories of his kindness, the mistakes he regretted, and the dreams he wished for but never achieved. Through these stories, Margaret realized that grief could be transformed into gratitude for having loved so deeply and for being so deeply loved in return. One afternoon, as autumn leaves began to drift through the village, Thomas sat across from Margaret by the window. "Will you tell your story?" he asked quietly. "The real story, not just what's remembered in the village." Margaret smiled, her eyes filled with the wisdom of her years. "Perhaps it's time," she said. Together they began collecting her memories, Edward's letters, the diary, the old photographs, and pieces of Margaret's life story as she was finally willing to speak it. Over tea and the soft rhythm of rain on the roof, the chapters of a small but extraordinary life began to take shape. Word spread quietly through Willow Lane that Margaret Wells, the mysterious old woman in the house on the corner, was writing a book. Children who had once been timid by her garden gate now came more freely, drawn by the scent of baking bread and the faint melody of Margaret's laughter. She welcomed them with stories of bravery, of love lost and found, and of how hope can persist even in the darkest hours. In this way, Margaret wove herself back into the heart of the village, not as a myth or a mystery, but as a friend and a storyteller. Months turned into seasons. Margaret's body grew frailer, but her spirit never dimmed. In the spring, Thomas arrived with a finished copy of the memoir they'd crafted together. The dedication read, "For Edward, and for all those who keep love alive by telling its story." On the first warm morning in May, Margaret returned once more to Talbot's Crossing, this time accompanied by the entire village, Thomas at her side, children laughing on the old rails, neighbors who had once whispered stories now cheering her name. At the foot of the sycamore, Margaret placed Edward's last letter beneath the stone one final time, not as a secret to hide, but as a truth to honor. As the sun rose through the willow branches, Margaret gazed at her gathered friends and at Thomas, who had become something like family. She realized that life was less about what was lost along the way and more about what could be given, even at the end. Margaret Wells passed away peacefully the following autumn, her home filled with music, letters, and the laughter of children. The book she and Thomas created became a cherished part of the village, a reminder that every life, no matter how ordinary or quiet, is shaped by stories, stories that outlive secrets, heartbreak, and even time. And so, the old house on Willow Lane remained, its windows brightened by new voices in gentle, golden light. And Margaret's story, once hidden in silence, became a legacy shared by all who would listen.